Hey guys, I'm Cameron. I'm a marriage therapist and the founder of the Hitched app, the first ever evidence-based personalized blueprint for lifelong marriage. So, conflict is one of the hardest parts about being married, especially repeated conflict. When couples are having a lot of fights, it can feel like it'll never end. And that's why in this video, I wanted to give you guys my 5-step formula for not only being more efficient in how you guys deal with conflict and more effective, but also how you guys can stop having the same fights over and over again and instead finally resolve those issues so you guys can focus on strengthening your marriage and building more emotional intimacy again. So the 5 steps in this formula are: step number 1, come up with a vision for your marriage together. Step number 2, make a shared set of rules for the relationship as guide rails to help you both stay on track toward that vision. Step number 3, implement a weekly routine for your time together. Step number 4, correctly diagnose the problems together when they arise. And step number 5, have a higher standard for yourself than for your spouse. Okay, before I jump into each of these steps in more detail, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And if you like the content of this video and you know someone who you think could get a lot out of it, please share it with them. That really lets me know that you guys want to see more of this type of content. Okay, step number 1, come up with a vision for your marriage. So even if you don't know the perfect example of what you want your marriage to look like yet, if you and your spouse are both unhappy in the relationship right now in some way or another, you at least know what you don't want out of the marriage. You don't want some of the things that are happening right now between the two of you. So if you look at least the opposite of that, if you're fighting a lot, if you look at the opposite of that, having less conflict or at least being more effective in dealing with your conflict and playing fairly when resolving that conflict, that's a good example of a characteristic of the sort of marriage you want. So the first thing you guys are going to do to really start tackling this conflict in your relationship is to spend the next week brainstorming on what you want your marriage to look like. You're actually going to sit down either every day for a week or at least every other day and spend significant time writing out exactly the sort of qualities you want in your relationship, maybe examples of other marriages that you've seen that you think are really great and why, in addition to marriages you've seen that you don't think are as great and why they fall short in your eyes. Try to be as specific as possible. How do you want the two of you to talk to each other? How much time do you want to spend? What do you want the breakdown in labor to be between covering childcare and earning an income for the family, and who does all of the household chores, or how you break that down? How do you guys talk to each other? How do you talk about each other? What character traits do you both want to exhibit? Are you going to be 100% honest with each other? Are you going to be gentle and compassionate? Are you going to be excited to see each other every day when you come home from work? Really try to paint a very specific picture of the sort of relationship that you want. And if you can even go a bit beyond that and figure out why exactly you think that is a good example of a marriage, that's even better. That's going to start to dig into your values. And so our values really underlie a lot of what we're going to think is right and wrong morally and in terms of our relationship. So talk about your financial values, your political values, your views on religion and spirituality, your views on parenting philosophy or how you want to approach being a parent, or whether or not you even want to have kids, your values around communication, what you think is the right way to communicate, and what you think is ultimately fair and good in a relationship. That's really going to drive a lot of your vision for your marriage. And that's where religious and spiritual couples might have a little bit of an easier time with this specific step because, for example, if you are a Christian couple or a Jewish couple, then you not only have a vision for marriage already from the Bible, and you already have the source that you believe is giving you that vision, God, but you also have already in the Bible a lot of examples of what the Judeo-Christian value system says is a good or a bad marriage. For my non-religious couples, this might be a little bit of a steeper climb, but that's totally fine. Chances are, like I was saying before, you already have some idea of what you think is good in a marriage and what you think is bad. And so collaborating with your spouse, at least over the next week, to really nail down the qualities that you guys want to live up to in your relationship is going to lay the foundation for the rest of this formula and for the rest of your marriage to be much more peaceful, much more harmonious. Step number 2, Make a shared set of rules for the relationship as guide rails to help you both stay on track toward that vision. So after you spend a week coming up with your vision, the next week you're going to spend making a set of rules or guidelines for moving towards that vision together. Again, you're going to write all this out, and you want to err on the side of having fewer rules, just because the fewer rules you have, the more likely you're going to be to actually adhere to each of them. If you think about it, if you have a list of 5 rules, that's a lot easier to remember, a lot easier to put effort towards each of those rules than if you have a list of 100. You're then going to rank each of those rules in order of importance, so most important at the top and least important at the bottom, so that as you guys are trying to change things in your marriage, you're paying most attention to the guidelines that matter most to you. And lastly, after you come up with this set of rules, you're going to talk about a way that you can gently bring up to each other if you guys are starting to meander outside of those guidelines. So if you're starting to operate outside of the rules or you're breaking the rules, how can you gently and lovingly pull each other back on course so that you're both moving towards your vision together? You'll want your rules to span all of the areas of the relationship where you're struggling most first, because chances are in the areas where you're not struggling, you probably don't need as many explicit rules. You guys are already doing well. But let's say you're struggling with communication. So some examples of good communication rules would be no yelling, no name calling, no physical contact that's not motivated by a positive emotion, no complaining about each other to friends and family. Obviously, you want the rules to be very personal to your relationship, but these are just some very popular ones with a lot of the couples that I've seen and clients that I've worked with. Other examples of general rules about how you guys treat each other could be that when you're spending time together, you're not on your phones, you're not distracted, you're really paying attention to each other. You try to be quick to forgive, especially if something's only happened once or twice. Maybe you don't even bring something up until it's happened 3 times. Maybe every time you guys are seeing each other after some time apart, so either when you're saying goodbye in the morning or you're saying hello in the evening, you give a hug and a kiss. Another good rule is 100% honesty. That's a really big one for a lot of couples. The best way to build a foundation of trust in a relationship is with honesty. You can even have more specific rules, like for example, not leaving dirty clothes on the floor, but putting them in the hamper. There are several reasons why having a shared set of rules is really good for a relationship. The first one is that you guys will both know if you're headed in the right or the wrong direction towards or away from your vision based on how closely you're aligning with your guidelines. So you won't get so far down the path away from the marriage you want before realizing it, because you'll have these small markers and indicators every day that you're doing something right or wrong. The second one is that it's a lot easier to apologize if you guys have come up with a set of rules together and agreed on them, because you're no longer apologizing for something that your spouse had to convince you that you did wrong. You both agreed not to call each other names, so if one or both of you are doing that, you're going to know, and you're going to be more likely to apologize and not feel like you're just doing it to appease your spouse, because this rule was partially made and agreed to by you. Next, the rules are consistent. They're not going to change based on your mood or your spouse's mood or circumstances, which means that you'll never have to worry about the rules of the game changing just because your spouse is having a rough day. Obviously, when we're having tough days, we want to be even more gentle and kind with each other, but you're still going to be expected to treat your spouse in a certain way, and your spouse is still going to be expected to treat you in a certain way, even if one or both of you are having a tough time. And the last advantage with having this set of rules, and my favorite one, is that you're not going to look like a whiner or a tyrant, meaning that because you both came up with these rules together, you're not just enforcing some arbitrary set of rules to your spouse, either signaling to your spouse that you are trying to control them, or that you're whining and complaining and that you're trying to enforce all of these things that don't really matter that much. You don't have to worry about either of you playing that role of being controlling or being a complainer. A really important note here: if you want this set of rules to work for your marriage, you can't use it to keep score against each other, meaning that you can't use the rules and how many times your spouse breaks the rules versus how many times you do as a way to signal that you are better, or as a way to punish your spouse extra for breaking some of these rules. That's the real risk here, is that these rules and guidelines can be awesome, but if you're not quick to forgive and move on when one or both of you are breaking rules, then it's going to end up looking like a game where you're both tallying up how much you've screwed up, and that's going to drive you guys further apart. So the rules need to serve as boundaries that you try to stay within to move towards your vision of the marriage you want together, as opposed to a way where you guys can push each other backwards or push each other down. Okay, step number 3, implement a weekly routine for your time together. So a lot of the times I see couples drift apart just because they aren't spending enough time together. And that happens in every relationship, whether it's family, friends, coworkers, whoever. When you stop spending enough time with someone because you're both constantly changing and evolving, you're not going to know each other well enough to stay close and to continue to communicate effectively. And the easiest way to make sure you guys are spending enough time together is by actually scheduling it into your calendar. So have a calendar together, whether it's, a printed calendar in your home or it's Google Calendar or whatever it is. Make sure you have a shared calendar and actually block off time in that calendar at the beginning of every month. Go in for the next 4 weeks and put in what time you're going to spend together. At a minimum, every day you want at least a 15 to 20 minute daily debrief conversation, meaning a conversation about both of your days. Try to include something that was really good that happened to you, something that maybe wasn't as great, and how you're feeling about the day, how everything went. The key here is that you're both sharing back and forth. That's going to be enough, at least on a daily schedule, to make sure that you're both staying in touch with each other. And then on a weekly basis, you want at least one, but preferably 2 weekly date nights that are at least 3 hours where you go somewhere with your spouse, do something you both really enjoy, and not talk about conflict, not talk about what's going on with the kids or what's going on at home, and just try to be in the moment together and do something fun. One of the best ways to kind of get out of your normal routine with each other of just whether it's co-parents or co-running a home together is by doing an activity you love, whether that's going to a movie or playing putt-putt or going out to a bar, whatever it is, just doing something together that you both really love. And then the last piece is that every week you also want to have a weekly family meeting, meaning that you spend at least 60, but preferably 90 minutes reviewing how the previous week went, talking about how the rules are going, if you need to adjust anything. And in these weekly family meetings, you want to make sure that you have a few ground rules so that they're effective. So a few of my favorite ground rules for weekly family meetings are things like making sure that you don't leave the table, or you at least don't end the conversation until you're both excited about your plan for the coming week. You want to make sure you're both very bought in. And so a similar rule to that could be something like you don't agree to a new arrangement or a new rule if you aren't excited about adopting it or you aren't hopeful that it's going to help the relationship. If you really don't think that, for example, you can stick to doing the dishes every night, then you shouldn't agree to that rule. Another really good rule for a family meeting is that the only way you can dispute someone else's suggestion for how to run things or how to make sure you guys are taking care of the home or the kids together is if you have your own suggestions. So just shooting down ideas but not giving one of your own, that usually is pretty ineffective when it comes to these family meetings. If you have children, it's actually a good idea to have them sit at the table with you. Depending on their age, if they're less than 5 years old or so, they probably can only stick around for 20 minutes. But if they're old enough, say 2 or 3 years old, where they can start doing small chores to contribute to the household, they're really going to appreciate being involved in the conversation. And it's going to help you guys signal to everyone that you are a family unit and you are working together towards some vision for your marriage and your family. Step number 4, correctly diagnose the problems together when they arise. So whether there is an issue coming up that it's about a broken rule or just a general sense of uneasiness or dissatisfaction in the relationship, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you're trying to get to the root of the actual problem. So instead of telling your spouse that you're really pissed off that he keeps leaving dirty clothes on the floor or keeps leaving dirty dishes in the sink, think hard about what's actually underlying your frustration with that issue. Because oftentimes what we think might be the problem actually is not the issue at all. It's usually not the fact that someone wore muddy shoes inside or your spouse didn't respond to your text fast enough. It's usually something deeper that makes you so upset. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't care that much since these issues are pretty small. So for example, if you're getting frustrated that your spouse isn't responding to text fast enough, it tends to be something more about feeling respected, feeling appreciated, or just knowing that your spouse is safe, being concerned that something might have happened if you can't predict when they're going to respond, or you don't have a way to know if they're actually okay. So digging together into the actual issue is the only way you're going to be able to solve what's actually causing these emotional outbursts or frustration with smaller issues. The best way to get to the root of an issue is to sit down together and do something called empathetic listening, which basically means you take turns talking about the issue. So, for example, if your spouse started, your spouse would talk about what she's thinking and why this matters to her. And then you're going to try to summarize what she said as well as you understand it. So you can ask clarifying questions. It's actually a really good idea. So as she's talking, when she stops, ask clarifying questions. Make sure you really understand what she's feeling, what she's thinking, where she's coming from, and then summarize back to her to make sure that you actually understand what she's saying, not just that you believe you understand. And once she tells you, yeah, that's actually exactly what I'm feeling, what I mean, then you guys switch and you will say, okay, but this is how I'm feeling. This is what I've been thinking about. This is why I'm upset right now. And then she'll do the same thing for you. Ask clarifying questions and try to summarize back to you exactly what it is that you are saying, thinking, feeling. In my opinion, this is one of the greatest techniques to come from it. An expert psychotherapist, Carl Rogers, he's really big in the therapy realm. This idea of confirming with your spouse that you actually are on the same page does a couple of things. Number one, it makes sure that you're actually not totally off target, because a lot of the times we think we know what our spouse is upset about and we'll say, yeah, I get it, I know that you're upset about this, but we can be wrong. But if we actually confirm with our spouse what the real problem is and what they're actually feeling, that's not only going to make sure that we're not totally off base, but it's also going to show our spouse that we actually care about what they're saying instead of just caring that they finish talking so that we can start talking. This is a huge skill that really helps every couple I've ever seen effectively implement it. It's helped their conflict resolution tremendously. So if you guys are practicing this empathetic listening, but it's not necessarily working well and you feel like, okay, there's something else here that we need to figure out why we're still struggling and having all these conflicts. Sometimes you actually just need to get to know each other better. Sometimes there can be fundamental differences in, for example, personality or values or life goals or other areas that are contributing to this repeated conflict. If you want to learn more about exactly how to get to know each other more deeply, I'll put a link in the description of this video to another video I made about that exact topic, where I take you through 5 steps of how to figure out these little nuanced differences that are sometimes difficult to detect that can actually lead to a lot of issues in the relationship if you don't know they exist. But if you do know they exist, they can actually strengthen your marriage because you can start addressing things in a complementary way instead of in a competitive or combative way. And step number 5. Have a higher standard for yourself than your spouse. So this essentially boils down to being a lot quicker to admit when you go wrong. The rules really help with this because you're not, again, being held to a standard by your spouse. It's your own standard involving these rules that you agreed to and you helped create. So being quicker to ask for forgiveness and admit when you are wrong for yourself, but then being quicker to point out when your spouse does something well. This is really an awesome way to improve your relationship for so many reasons, but one of them is that having a higher standard for yourself is going to set a really great example for your spouse. You're going to show that you are trying as hard as you can and you are doing the right things. And that's going to encourage your spouse to do the same, to mirror back to you that same level of effort. It might take some time, but over weeks, over months, however long it is for the two of you will be unique. The more effort you're putting in, the more your spouse is going to start to reciprocate, especially if you're not pushing those expectations on your spouse and instead you're holding them for yourself. And then you're being quick to point out when your spouse does something well. We all respond better to reward than punishment for the most part. That's just how the typical human psychology works, that we really love to be rewarded, especially by the people who we care about the most. So if you can reward the good things your spouse does, you're going to keep encouraging them to do that over and over. And then when you're quick to point out that you went wrong, that's going to set a great example for your spouse to do the same. Okay guys, I hope these 5 steps were helpful. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for all things related to how to build a lifelong marriage. And if you liked this video, please share it with someone you know. That helps me know that you guys want to see more content like this. I'm Cameron, and this is Modern Marriage.